let's be honest, Alireza Firouzja has had a pretty rough go of it in the Super Bets Chess Classic. Of course, it's been almost half a year since he's played serious tournament chess at a classical time control. And in this particular tournament so far, he's had one loss and four draws. And in those games, he's had a winning position probably three times, or if he made the right move, he would have won. And to me, there's no greater reflection of just being rusty and being out of practice than failing to win a one game. That's what really requires precision. And there are four more rounds in this tournament. I think he's going to be okay. I don't see anything here that suggests he's lost his creativity, that he's lost his edge as a player. Just there is rust. He's not winning one positions. The game I would like to go over with you today was played against Bogdan-Daniel Deac. And he's sort of one of the more local players. Sometimes they'll invite a slightly lower rated player to these big tournaments. He's rated around 2650. And most of the players in this tournament are 2750 and above. And Alireza Firouzja has the black pieces, and he immediately tries to complicate things from the start. Deac plays d4, Firouzja plays knight f6, and he plays a King's Indian defense, trying to sharpen the play. d6, bishop e2, castles. And here Deac plays a sideline, h4. Of course, moves like h4 and g4 have become very popular in modern chess. But this is a first surprise of the position. He wants to open up the h-file, potentially to attack. Knight to c6, black can play c5 here. h5 is a safer move. Knight to c6 immediately goes after this d4 square, attacking the dark squares in the center as you do in a King's Indian. d5, knight to e5. And you notice this particular structure, while white has space, there's a relationship between this e5 square and this g4 square. The knight is comfortable on e5, and if white tries to kick it out by playing f4, then the g4 square becomes available. So white sort of has to choose his poison. Does he let a knight settle on e5 or on g4? But he plows ahead with h5, c6, and then h6. He could have just played knight to f3 here, but he decides to gain space. That pawn could become vulnerable later, but it's irritating for the time being. And white has a clear space advantage, while black has counterplay on the dark squares. Knight f3. The knight goes to g4. He wants to avoid exchanges. A safer idea is just to take on f3 and play queen to b6. Get a pair of pieces off the board since you have less space. But Firouzja wants to keep things complicated. He's playing for a win. That's all there is to it. So knight e to g4, castles, queen to b6, controlling key dark squares, and Deac plays queen to b3. And Firouzja thought this was a good move from white. He's trying to keep things safe. Firouzja's trying to complicate. White's trying to keep it safe. Knight to h5 is his move, threatening to pop into g3, which would gain the two bishops. So knight h2 puts pressure on g4. The bishop and the knight hit the g4 knight. Knight h to f6, and now knight to f3. Deac would be happy to repeat moves here, it looks like, but Firouzja is having none of it. So he plays knight to d7. The knight heads for the nice c5 square, a common square for a knight to settle in King's Indian defenses. The queen moves to c2, so the knight doesn't hit it. Knight goes to c5. And here, black's main way of generating counterplay is going to be the push f5. That's how he wants to open up the f-file and get counterplay by attacking the center with the f5 pawn, similar to what you might see in some Benoni structures. Bishop to f4, a5, keeping white from kicking the knight away with b4. Rook a to e1, centralizing. Now f5, ef5. He decides to take with the rook, an interesting choice. Taking with the bishop was also a good move, and maybe a little bit safer. But he takes with the rook. Bishop goes to g5, hitting the e7 pawn. He defends it by retreating the queen to d8, queen to d2, and now queen to f8. What Firouzja would like to do here is actually take the knight on c3, and after queen takes c3, play knight to e4, which attacks the bishop and the queen simultaneously. The problem with that, of course, is queen to g7 checkmate would be the move. So in order to set up that threat, he plays queen to f8, and that controls the g7 square. Now he is threatening. Bishop takes c3. Bishop to d1. That controls the e4 square with the rook, so the knight couldn't go there anymore. Also threatens to take on e7. The rook goes back to defend that. b3 to strengthen the structure. And now knight to h6. Firouzja gets a pawn. It's still probably a better position for white despite that pawn, but it's something at least. Pawn takes, pawn takes. And here, Deac plays the move knight to d4, a move that at first glance, when I saw the move, thought it was perfectly fine. I mean, you're hitting the c6 pawn. But it turns out that he had a good opportunity to really get a strong advantage here with the move knight to a4. And black can't just take the knight, because if he does, then bishop takes h6 is an intermediate move that attacks the queen at f8. And when the queen moves, then he would take the knight. So he would actually lose a piece if he takes the knight on a4. And what this allows is, it means white's going to be able to take on c5 and double the pawns and just have a very nice position. But that move was missed, and instead he played knight to d4, and now Firouzja is beginning to get into the game and get a decent position. He plays knight to f5, and now black is well placed and has a good game, and even has that extra pawn he grabbed on h6. Knight takes c6, he gets the pawn back, but now bishop to b7, and Firouzja gets a nice long diagonal leading to the g2 pawn. Bishop to f3 to neutralize that, and now rook to a6. The commentators thought that rook to c8 was probably the better move. A variation such as knight e7, knight takes, bishop b7, knight b7, capture a few times. And here black is just up a piece with a better position. A rook to a6 costs a tempo because the rook's going to have to go back. So rook to a6 still hits the knight on c6 and forces a similar variation, but the rook's just a little out of place. So knight e7, bishop b7, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3. That knight was actually a pretty good piece. It could settle in on the d5 square, so he doesn't want that. Queen takes c3, knight takes b7. So the exchanges are over, and black is up a piece, but white has a pawn in exchange for that piece, and some real compensation. You'll see black's king is much less safe than white's. These pawns are a little scattered. The pawn structure is not healthy. But also very important are the weaknesses of these dark squares all around black's king. And white has a dark squared bishop to attack those squares, but black does not have a dark squared bishop to defend them. All the same, black is a bit better with the material advantage. Rook to e2, h6, knight to f5 was a strong alternative, controlling some of these dark squares. h6, bishop to c1, and you see what Deac wants to do. He wants to play bishop to b2 and threaten mate along this diagonal. Rook to a8, bishop to b2, threatening mate at h8, but the king moves to h7, so the queen at f8 covers that mating square. Rook f to e1, knight c5, queen d2, knight to f5, queen d5, h5 to make sure that white doesn't kick that knight away with g4. Bishop to c3 puts some pressure on the a5 pawn. The knight goes back to d7. It can reroute itself to e5, or perhaps go to f6 at some point. Rook drops in to e6, putting pressure on these two pawns, g6 and d6. Rook to c8, and bishop to a5. So black has a clear advantage, and this is, again, I think, an example of the fatigue. Here, Firouzja misses a really great opportunity. The right move here looks to be rook to c5 with an attack on the queen and the bishop, a double attack. So if white plays queen to d2, retreats it to defend the bishop, then knight to e5, and now the rook on e6 is in trouble. It doesn't have any squares, and the threat of queen to c8 hitting that rook is really bad news for white, and white would probably be just lost in this position. So Firouzja missed that rook to c5 move. He instead plays knight to f6, queen retreats, rook to e8, bishop c3, rook takes, knight to d7. And now white has enough activity, despite the material imbalance, to hold the position. A better move than knight to d7 might have been knight to g4. The idea here is that black might want to play the idea queen to d8, queen to h4, and that would cause white to deal with some pretty serious pressure on his king side. So knight to g4 was probably a stronger idea there. Knight to d7, queen to g5, hitting the g6 pawn, defending with queen to g8, g4, takes, knight to e5, queen to h3 check, knight to h6, and rook takes d6. So white has the pawns, and both kings are vulnerable. But the truth is, this position is equal. It's a drawish position because neither side can really find a way through. If white tries to advance the pawns, then that gives black time to attack white's king. Otherwise, black can't really win either because his own king is vulnerable. So queen to e8, queen to e6, rook to e7, hitting the queen, queen to d5, knight goes back, hits the rook at d6, rook f6, rook d7, hits the queen moves to e6, rook to d1 check, king g2, queen takes, rook takes, knight to f5, rook to e1, and here Firouzja can't really, or shouldn't really take the rook, because after bishop takes, these three pawns are actually difficult for these knights to stop. They probably can be stopped, but it makes black's job much harder. So he avoids the rook exchange with rook to d3, a rook to c1, knight to g5, and he acknowledged in the post-mortem, Firouzja, that he just doesn't have enough activity to put pressure on white's king here. The knights look active, but there's just not enough. King to f1, knight to e6, bishop e5, rook to d2, hitting this pawn at a2, b4. The pawns begin to march, and white will be able to use these pawns to win one of black's knights, but it will leave an endgame that's very difficult, really impossible to win. Rook takes a2, c5, rook to a4, and if white plays b5 here, just rook to b4, and if b6, then rook to b5, and that forces the win of a pawn if c6, rook takes b6. And we have a position similar to the game. c6, rook takes b4, c7, and then that wins the knight, and this is just a draw. With one pawn on the king's side each, there's just nothing to be done here. Check, and a few moves were played, and they just went back and forth for a little bit and agreed to a draw. So Firouzja's first half of this tournament has not been the way he had hoped, but we're still seeing the creativity, we're still seeing the energy, we're just seeing a little bit of that rust, and I think the second half of the tournament is probably going to go better for him. I hope it does. You can put in the comment section how you think the second half of the tournament is going to go. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.